After 3 days of living with strikes, sirens and fear, residents of Kyiv brace themselves for another night of sheltering underground as Russian troops close in on the capital's outskirts. Ukraine has denied Russian claims that it is refusing to negotiate a ceasefire with Russia, but says that it is not ready to accept any kind of ultimatums or unacceptable conditions. Ukraine's wartime President Zelensky has called on his people to take up arms and defend their country. He has claimed that the country's forces had repulsed the Russian assault and vows to keep up the struggle. This as Zelensky reiterates his appeal for more help from the outside world.
Київ та ключові міста навколо столиці контролюються саме нашою армією. Окупанти хотіли заблокувати.
We have withstood and successfully repelled the attacks of the enemy. The fights continue in many cities and regions of the state, but we know what we are protecting: the country, the land, and the future of children. It is our army that controls Kyiv and key cities around the capital.
Полях тривала справжня битва за Київ.
Kyiv's mayor has announced that the curfew has been tightened around the capital and all violators will be considered to be the enemy. Central Kyiv appears quiet on Saturday, though sporadic gunfire could be heard. Meanwhile, Britain's defense minister says that the bulk of Russian forces were 30 kilometers from the middle of the city. Russia, meanwhile, says that its assault on Ukraine is aimed only at military targets. But bridges, schools and residential neighborhoods have been hit since the invasion began on Thursday with air and missile strikes. And Russian troops entering Ukraine from the north, east and south. Ukraine's health minister has said that 198 civilians have been killed in conflict so far, including 3 children. Meanwhile, Russian Defense Ministry says that they are not targeting Ukrainian cities. The conflict has driven thousands of Ukrainians from their homes in search of safety. In fact, UN officials say that more than 120,000 Ukrainians have already left the country for Poland, Moldova and other neighboring nations. Now, for more analysis and perspective on this broadcast, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our guests on this broadcast. Joining us now live is Ruslan Botnik, who is a political analyst from Kyiv. He's joining us now from Kyiv in Ukraine at this hour. Also joining us is Terry Schulz, who is a journalist from Brussels, and Vasyl Filipchuk, who is the chairman of the International Center for Policy Studies and Ukrainian diplomat from Brussels. Thank you so much to our esteemed panel for joining us at this hour. My first question I'd like to take to Ruslan. I want to start by asking you, what do you make of the recent offer from the US, $350 million in military assistance to Ukraine? Will this be enough to arm Ukraine against Russia?
Of course, it's great support from the United States, but this support is not on time. We don't have enough time to use this support to buy enough weapons or to train our soldiers. We don't have enough time to use this money effectively. So money is good, political support is good, the pressure on Russia in this situation is also an instrument, but I think the Western partners of Ukraine lost a lot of time to really really support Ukraine, and for nowadays Ukraine is alone with Russian troops in our country.
Right. Thanks for that, Ruslan. Coming to you now, Terry, let's talk about NATO. Ukraine has been asking to be made a member of the alliance for a while now. What has stopped NATO to do the same?
Well, NATO will say that there is a process for membership in the alliance, and Ukraine has been going along this path now for many years, and was promised in 2008 at NATO's Bucharest summit that eventually Ukraine and Georgia would both be members. But there are a lot of things to fulfill that Ukraine hasn't done yet. Some of these are reforms of armed forces. And then, of course, it got a lot more complicated in 2014 when Russia invaded Ukraine the first time and seized Crimea. So now you've got a country with occupied territory, and that would be very difficult to integrate into NATO, even if Ukraine were ready in all other aspects, which it actually isn't. Of course, there's been a lot more pressure on the alliance now in the last year, certainly in the last months and in the last days and hours, to bring Ukraine into the fold. that's something that isn't in the cards at this moment.
Right. Let's now get your perspective, Vasil. You, of course, given your expertise, how do you see the crisis unfolding in the coming few days? And what's your assessment of the developments that are currently taking place in Ukraine at this hour?
Well, first of all, I think our army showed its strengths, and I think it's a huge surprise for Russians, for Mr. Putin to see so strong resistance from everywhere. On every street, in every village, every town, everywhere in the country, no one is meeting them with flowers, everyone is meeting them with arms, with hate, with all the obstacles we can do to stop Russian invaders. I think no one ever has united Ukrainians like Putin now in resistance to Russian invasion. I've never seen all Ukrainians sharing the same goals, the same emotions. We are all shocked and we are all united to resist Russian invasion. What is important for us here at this program, I think it's very clear. First of all, it's barbaric actions from Mr. Putin, which should not be tolerated by any country. I was really surprised today to read that Putin spoke to his Indian counterparts and explained, and it was received with understanding. I don't know, maybe it's Russian fake and disinformation, but I think India and all civilized world have just stopped talking to Mr. Putin. He should not be handshakeable.
We'll, of course, discuss Putin's strategy in kind of aligning with other countries later in the broadcast. Coming back to you, Ruslan, you are in Kyiv, in Ukraine at this hour. Tell us a little bit about what's happening around you. We've been hearing about martial law being imposed. We've also heard about continued shelling, an apartment building that caught fire after an attack. Tell us what's happening on ground.
I don't see the big panic, for example, or I don't see the big or heavy clashes in the Kyiv now. But the city and the streets almost empty, and we have big queues to the pharmacies and some shops, grocery shops, which are still works. We see the very small amount of cars as ordinary. Most people now are in their flats or in the basements where they're looking for the places to be defended from the ceasefire or shelling. Which is sometimes happening in Kyiv, but we see that some last night we see some types of violence in the streets, but no Russian war, no Russian troops in the streets for nowadays in Kyiv. People are scared, of course. People are preparing for the worst situation in this situation, but at the same time, Kyiv is still live, and road transport is works. People trying to find the best place for living in this situation.
Right, Terry, I want to get my next question. I want to take my next question with you. Will this violence spread into other NATO members such as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland and Romania? What will be the implications of what is now seeming like a full-scale invasion for Europe at large?
Yeah, that's certainly the concern. And that's what NATO's guarding against, of course, as it always says. Ukraine does not have these Article 5 guarantees, but these other countries that you mentioned, the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, they do have the guarantee of NATO's 30 countries behind it. And so that's what you've seen the alliance do, reinforce its own territory to Ukraine's heartbreak, of course. So they've been sending thousands more troops. The United States in particular has sent many thousands, I think upwards of 12,000 extra troops just now in the recent weeks. and other countries as well. France is leading a new battalion that will go into Romania. You've seen even Germany send more troops to Lithuania, Netherlands sending equipment, France sending equipment. I mean, really, NATO allies have stepped up to reinforce their eastern flank. No one suggests that President Putin would step across that border into NATO territory. But at the same time, there were plenty of people who didn't think he'd do what we see happening today. And so no one can be sure. And even the instability is a factor in these countries, and having more troops and more equipment there is reassuring to them. The other thing that they're looking at is the number of Ukrainian refugees that are coming into Poland and into the Baltic states to some extent, and they are being welcomed. The European Union has a role to play here, and they have already put in place some of the infrastructure assistance that they have, and everyone's saying that Ukrainian refugees are welcome in neighboring states.
Right. I'm glad you pointed that out, because we've actually been airing reports on our network about there being an exodus of refugees who are now trying to flee Ukraine, and they've all amassed at Poland's border. Now, coming back to you, Vasil, let's talk about the Western reaction to all of this. UK forces have arrived in Eastern Europe to reinforce NATO's Eastern Front. That's what the Ministry of Defense says. The US currently is promising more aid. But the big question is Russia afraid of global isolation?
No, I don't think Russia is afraid of global isolation, as they have good alliance with China, and Russia and China is already quite a lot. So I think Russia is afraid the most from Ukrainian resistance, which would lead to thousands of Russian soldiers killed, and what we see already 3 days of resistance. It's already something which we achieved and which sends a strong message to Putin. He will not take it for granted. He might take over land, but not people. And price for this adventure, for this crime for Russia will be horrible. So West, of course, Western reaction is on one side good that they react, good that they send us weapons and they think about sanctions. But it's, as always, too late and too little. I think West must impose the toughest ever sanctions, just like with Northern Korea. Russia should be not handshakeable. There should be Russian embassies closed. Right. Russia should become in absolute isolation. And on the other side, what we need is support to our asylum, our war refugees, and support of Ukraine with weapons.
Absolutely. I think the talk of sanctions and the need for harsher sanctions is something that most experts and analysts are now calling out for. Coming back to you, Ruslan, now you're in Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital, which is, of course, which has taken global center stage at this hour. Another figure that's taken center stage is, of course, the Ukraine president, Zelensky. He has refused to leave Kyiv despite an offer from the United States to evacuate him. He earlier said that he's target number one for Russia. What can you tell us about that?
I don't think he's the target number one for Russia, but we should. I think he is the post of president of Ukraine is a political symbol of Ukraine for nowadays. And if president will leave Kyiv, it will mean that he will be losing by the face of Russian forces. And this is political symbol, and Zelensky understands it, and I think his team, political team, will be till then in our city, in our capital, because Russia is waiting scary on the face of Zelensky. Russia is waiting the time when Zelensky escapes from the Kyiv, and it will be a victory for Russia. All understand this, and we don't know where is Zelensky at real life, but we hope, and the president says for us, that he is still in capital. Russia is not going to kill Zelensky, you should understand. Russia wants to see the picture when Zelensky escapes from Kyiv, and it should be a victory for Russia.
Right. Terry, I want your perspective on the same as well. Now, in moments of conflict and crisis, we see a leader emerge at that time. What is your perception of how Zelensky has handled himself as well as fought for his country in terms of handling this crisis?
I think you've heard leader after leader praise Volodymyr Zelensky for his calm, his bravery. I was at the Munich Security Conference a week ago when he gave a speech to a standing ovation and criticized the European Union. Of course, that time the invasion hadn't started yet, and said, look, you've got all these sanctions and you're telling us that we're going to be invaded, but that you can't impose your sanctions before that. If you're so sure, do it now. And, you know, of course, that didn't happen. And then we saw just a few days later the invasion start. He's also been very critical of NATO, saying you need to let us in now. So I think in many ways, he's been fearless, standing up against these huge institutions that he and his people, and I would have to say many people here as well, feel should have done more. I've in fact just come back to join you from a huge demonstration in downtown Brussels, thousands of people, and not just Ukrainians, thousands of people from everywhere standing up and saying NATO should do more, cut Russia off of SWIFT, create a no-fly zone.
Right, Terry, there seems to be some audio issue in your feed. We'll try and get back to you as soon as possible. Vasil, coming back to you, let's talk about the contentious issue of sweeping sanctions that have been imposed by the West on Russia. Will they work to deter Russian aggression at this point? They have clearly failed to do so in the past.
No, I don't really think there is any sanction which could really force Putin to change his mind. They already survived sanctions of 2014. They modernize their economy. They have a serious relationship with China. So I think that sanctions will have a long-term effect on Russia, just really transforming it into Iran or Northern Korea type of country. But for the moment, no. Certainly in course of next weeks or months, Russia will behave like that. That's why I repeat that West must not only talk about the strongest sanctions, but we have to rebuild the global decision-making system for international security. Russia is in UN Security Council. How killers can be there? I think UN has to exclude Russia from its participation. Russia has to be deprived from Security Council veto, and then UN could impose real decisions which would stop Russians. With ordinary sanctions, no, they will not work. We should think innovative. We should really find a way to be on the level of cynicism and actions which Putin has. Our response should be of the same type of strong and efficient.
Right, and on that note, it's time to wrap up this discussion. I'd like to thank and express my gratitude to all our esteemed guests who joined us on this broadcast and gave all their insights. Thank you for joining us on WION World is One. WION World is One is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.